Amy, did you have a chance to look at the links on the website yet? Because I got mixed reviews about whether they worked or not.
Yeah, there was one that didn't work, but I thought I got it through another link, and maybe that was an incorrect assumption I made at like the framing document. Were there 2 framing documents?
No, the framing document link didn't work.
Yeah, there was one framing document link that didn't work, but then another framing document link did work, so I assumed it was the same.
You got one.
That's what you intended. Yeah.
Okay, I'll check
but I wasn't able to watch through the entire class of last week. So I don't know if I'm missing something that I should have had prepared.
But you were able to get to it. That's my.
I was, yeah. I'm only about halfway through though.
Okay, awesome. I have never had so many problems trying to upload recordings. It has been, I've got them now on YouTube and Dropbox and Zoom, and just trying to get them up there somewhere where you can see them. And Mehdi said that he couldn't get to the Zoom links because they needed a password, so I redid them. So just if you look at any of those and they are not working for you, let me know. I want to talk for just a few minutes before John gets here. Did you all listen to the audio pieces? Did you have a chance to listen to the 2 audio pieces? Mm-hmm. That was your homework? Mm-hmm. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. And what are some questions that came up for you, or things that you were intrigued by, or like, are there some areas about audio practice or ethics that you particularly want to make sure we talk about with John? Fonda? Oh, you're still muted.
You're muted.
You're still muted.
Is that better?
Yeah, there you go.
Now?
Yep.
Yeah, so that's what I want to do. I just feel like that works really well with me. I like sound, and I just thought it was so interesting. I think it adds so much, and I don't really know. What I'm a little concerned about is like, I won't know, like, I don't know if people can teach you that, because it seems like it's just kind of like a gift. So I'm a little nervous about it, but that's really the part that I really like to focus on, is adding sound to material to make it vibrant, I guess. I mean, it was just, the pieces were so good. It just kind of came alive to me. Mm-hmm. And I was a little concerned about, like, you know, how do you get that? How do you amplify it? Like, is that illegal if you do that or edit it, and people maybe don't give, you know, they're okay on that? Like, you know, in words you can put exclamation marks around things, but like if you amplify someone's voice, it does change the connotation. So I don't know how that works, like with documentaries. Is that even possible, or is it illegal? Is it wrong if you kind of resonate on a word?
Okay, so if you use some kind of sound technique to emphasize what someone's saying, or make their voice louder in a certain place to underline, okay, we can talk about that. I'm not going to answer questions now because I want to talk about it with John, but the question about how much you manipulate audio and what ways you manipulate audio are very much, I mean, a lot of audio related ethics center around those questions. So those are good ones to have. Anybody else? Yeah, Barry.
I was just saying, I didn't know.
You know, I guess my library background shows, but text, we have a very, very well-developed system of organizers, from titles and subtitles and side heads and a variety of nested areas that give structure to what you're reading. And I tend to get lost in audio without that. I find trying to place myself, where am I do I remember this voice? Do I remember this comment? Which ones are important? How do I make it all come together as a whole and follow the discussion and the argument, the meaning of what's going on? And that just disturbed me. I found I liked the NPR production much better, because then they made comments that were introductory and concluding, and it was structured a little better for me. But that's my, how do you structure an audio documentary so that people can comprehend it and follow it more accurately?
Yeah, that's a great point. And part of what you're touching on is the difference in audience. You're not going to please everyone. You know, some of you might really like doing really experimental audio with a lot of stuff, and some people aren't going to like that, and that's okay. Like your job or desire isn't to make everybody happy. You have to figure out who, you know, is going to be interested in the kind of work or the kind of storytelling you want to do, and then make sure your work is getting to them. So Barry, I hear you saying you really like more structure, and you kind of like the narrative frame of having a voiceover saying, all right, this is what the story is going to be about. John really likes to do unnarrated work and let the characters in the story reveal it and kind of let it unfold and spool out naturally. But that is not, it is true that it's not the kind of thing you can listen to as easily like while you're doing something else, you know, with half an ear, right? It's not kind of like, here's the outline, here's the header, here's the sidebar, and you can, you know, kind of keep track of it. You have to read it, you have to sit with it the way you would read a book more and be fully absorbed in it. I noticed I was listening to a podcast yesterday while I was cleaning, going through pictures, which wasn't just mindless cleaning, but was requiring me to like make a lot of decisions and sorting and things. And I'm gonna have to just listen to the whole thing over again, because it was nice to have voices talking, but I wasn't really paying it. I couldn't really remember it. You know, I didn't have the mindfulness to sit and listen to that story. But that's the difference with audio. You know, if you're reading and you go, now wait a minute, whose brother was that, right? Wait a minute, what happened? You can just flip back a page and remind yourself. And in audio, you can't. And so that question of how do you make sure that you're pulling your audience along and not losing them and keeping it focused, and they know, you know, even things like pronouns, if you say he and then they have to think, well, wait, are you talking about this male character or that male character that you referred to as he earlier? Those kinds of things. And that's very germane and pertinent to your presentations as well, because I think, I was thinking this week, you should think of me as like a relatively stupid ox that you're trying to take on somewhere, you know, to the pasture, right? And there's not a right route to get there. Like, you can go lots of different ways. You can make lots of different choices about how you want to get me there, but you have to get me by the nose and you have to lead me there. You have to kind of assume that if you give me a choice, hey, John, if you give me a choice, if you stop and let me choose, I'm going to wander the wrong direction, you know? So how do you keep me moving the way you want me to go? Hey, John, how are you?
Good. How are you all?
Good.
Good to see you.
Yeah. We were just collecting some things that people particularly want to know about audio. And two things that have come up very topically. One is, how do you put structure in an audio piece to pull your listener along? We were mentioning that in a written piece, if you get confused, you can go back a few paragraphs and look, but in an audio piece, you've got to, you know, stay with it. You have to keep that context going. So tips for that. And then some questions about how much can you change? Can you change someone's voice to make it, to emphasize it? How much can you play with sound ethically? So I think both those things will probably come up in our conversation. Let's see, how can we share who's in the room? This is what I hate most about being online, is you can't go around in a circle because everybody's circle looks different on your screen. So how about if I just say your name, and if you can just briefly, you know, tell John who you are, very brief, just a sentence or two, and what your particular interest is in, if you do audio work or film or writing or photography or whatever. Okay, so Barry, will you start?
I'm a retired librarian, digital librarian, and a photographer. And I was fascinated by the audio pieces today, listening, because as you moved from one speaker to the next, to the next, to the next, and back and forth, I was having trouble developing lines of thought. And since I'm so used to text and to visual pictures, I just found it a little bit disorienting to listen to the audio and to follow it. And so I'm very interested to hear. I'm also very, very interested in adding audio. So I'm very interested in your work.
Okay, thank you.
Fonda?
Hi, so my name is Fonda Ingram. I am a engineer, computer scientist, and this is my second class, so I'm pretty new to documentaries, but I do like them, and I'm very interested in sound also. That's kind of like where I'd like my sweet spot to be if I can ever get really good. So I did have a question a lot about ethically about sound enhancement, and those are my children screaming back there, so I'm gonna go on mute. Even though daddy's on duty.
Hear you. Been there.
Thanks, Fonda. Anna Teresa?
Hi, I'm Anna Teresa, and I'm a photographer. And I'm also an instructor of art and design at William Peace University. And I should be finishing up the certificate either at the end of this year or next May.
Wonderful. Hey.
Kelsey?
Hey, I'm Kelsey. I am working in audio currently, but I'm new to it. I'm working on a criminal justice story, a Central Florida case where there's an innocent man in prison. So we're working on a story to hopefully get him some legal help. Yeah.
Thanks. Lorenzo?
I'm Lorenzo. I'm in Charlottesville, Virginia. I'm a website manager, and I've been doing documentary film for 5 or 6 years now. So that's where my interest lies. This is my, say, 4th class at CDS.
Great. Amy?
Hi, John. Thanks for being here. I am a sales engineer turned stay-at-home mom, and I'm trying to create the podcast that I really needed when I became a mom. It's stories about matrescence, so stories about women actually becoming mothers, not parenting or kids, but just focusing on the transformation that women go through. So I'm looking forward to anything you have to say, because it's my first project, first audio, or really any kind of creative venture.
Exciting. Great.
Anne?
I am Anne. I'm in California. I'm a lawyer who represents people on death row. And this is my 2nd class with Joy, which has been wonderful. And I like video. And I want to retire and come to North Carolina and do a program at CDS. So.
Come on over.
Okay.
Joanna?
Hi, I'm a Master of Environmental Management student at Duke, and I'm interested in using audio and photography to tell stories about sea level rise and coastal change, especially in the Southeast.
Great.
And Judith?
Hi, I'm a working freelance consultant at this time. I was at UNC doing variety of communication things in the School of Public Health, worked in global health for quite a long time. But I'm looking now at, I'm kind of interested in moving away from the sort of promotional bent that comes to that being an in-house communication person, various places. And I'm interested in telling stories about transitions, how people make transitions. And I'm very interested in documenting the work of various artists and art groups at this point in time. I mean, always interested in public health and social justice, but I'm sort of taking I don't know, at this point I'm very inclined toward the art stories of artists and performance groups, things like that. Oh, and this is my third course at the Duke Center.
And then we also have a distance student, a very distant student, Mehdi, who is in India, and it's like 3 a.m. there. So he watches the class when he gets up in the morning. So we'll say hello to you from him as well. And has studied fiction filmmaking and is now interested in documentary work. So that's us.
Okay. Great. Great. Good to meet you all. Impressive group. Hope everybody's staying safe and doing well. We're obligated to say that in every communication these days, but I mean it, right? So how would you like me to start, Joy, or how do you want to do this?
Well,
why
don't you
just,
give us
have conversation, or?
Yeah, give us, a little bit of your background and how you got into doing audio documentary, and maybe what you really like about that form of documentary storytelling. What your passion is in it, or what you think it really is particularly suited for, and then we'll go from there.
Sure, happy to do it. And I can't remember if you were letting me know this, Joy, but what did you all listen to in terms of audio?
We listened to the 2 versions of Nuevo South.
Oh, okay.
Partly,
okay, great.
Well, partly because everyone is in a place right now of trying to figure out how to put together their own story of what they're working on in a short period of time. And so there aren't that many opportunities to hear 2 published pieces that have been done in 2 different ways. And I think it's helpful to think about there's not the right answer. There are multiple ways that you can tell a story. It's partly what works for this venue, or to get this, agenda done, or whatever. So, yeah.
Right. Okay. So I've been doing audio, radio, journalism, and documentary work for about more than 30 years, going on 35 years, ever since I stumbled into it right out of college. And I worked in the public radio system for many years, Minnesota Public Radio. I worked at NPR News in the Rocky Mountain West. And I worked for something called American Radio Works, which is a documentary production house for the national networks for a number of years. And I've been at CDS, depending on how you count it, I've been here physically since 2001, but at that time I wasn't working for CDS and kind of got swallowed up by CDS over the following few years. So full-time since 2006. And in that time, that's been one of the great things about my job at CDS is it's remained part of my job to make stuff. So, you know, in taking me on, CDS sort of decided that one of the things it was going to do was it was going to be a radio documentary production house. And then over the last going on 5 years, like a lot of people, I went from producing stuff for the public radio system to producing this podcast. And that's a huge transition because you go from, there's this enormous trade-off, right? Where you go from having a built-in audience when you take stuff, you know, you deal with the gatekeepers at NPR, or you put out a special through this distribution system to stations, to public radio stations across the country. And you know, roughly, you know, that's going to be heard by a few million or a million, you know, depending on how it's put out or what show it's on. But there are a lot of constraints, right? You have to create the piece in such a way that it works for that program or within their time limits. Sometimes the time limits were tending to just get shorter and shorter, has been the trajectory, say, with NPR, you know, news magazines. Anyway, so then the trade-off is that you start a podcast and now you've got complete editorial and creative freedom and you have zero audience to start with. So then it becomes this entrepreneurial thing where you have to kind of scare up an audience over time. So anyway, that's sort of the short version of my so-called career. But I, as you know, I also teach some continuing ed and undergrad courses at Duke and at CDS. What do I love about it? You know, I just, by the time that I'd finished college, I was a philosophy major, which is like, what's that? Like, what are you going to do with that, right? And basically, I had just figured out that I was interested in ideas and in kind of thinking about stuff and the way the world is, and in communicating it. You know, I like to write, I like to present, and you know, so it was, in retrospect, it was. You know, I was sort of made to do this in a way, I think. It just took me a while to figure that out. But the idea that you sort of learn some stuff, and especially trying to learn stuff that you think maybe a lot of people don't know or that they don't understand in a very clear way. And you sort of organize your thoughts and you do research and you talk to smart people and then you present it, and there's a creative aspect in putting that together in an engaging way, and there's a craft to it that I find incredibly satisfying and fun, frankly. So I've ever since I really kind of found myself doing this work, there hasn't been anything else that I've really been, you know, I haven't looked back really. So how's that for a start? I would love to answer any questions you have. Or Joy, have you told them, these folks, about the kind of stuff that I've been doing on Scene on Radio the last few years?
So,
like
maybe half the class was in my traditions class, which is now the, you know, part one of the intro class. And we do talk about kind of audio forms and the going from, you know, radio and NPR storytelling and then into podcasting. And so we've looked at, you know, some of those links and things like that, but I'm sure that not everyone has had a chance to listen to Scene on Radio. So talk a little about it.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe I'll just briefly, because what I've been doing since 2017, I guess, I started working on this series. So one thing, there's this phenomenon with podcasting. Now, podcasting itself is a phenomenon, and I have to say I'm one of those people that is just thrilled that podcasting is a thing, and that it's sort of grown up in the way that it has, so that a lot of people listen, and in particular, there's this sort of phenomenon of the podcast series, and it's just kind of funny that the general common wisdom was that nobody has any attention span anymore, especially younger people. Nobody wants to hear anything more than 3 minutes long, and that was kind of gradually, increasingly the message from, as I said, from the NPR news programs. You used to be able to do a 20-minute piece for All Things Considered back in the 1990s. Rarely on the NPR show, All Things Considered, rarely do they air anything more than about 5 minutes anymore, right? So there was this general sense, nobody, but now not only do you have long form work, but you have these 8, 10, 12, 14 part series on podcasts that are, maybe a total of an 8-hour documentary project spooled out over a series of episodes. And I think actually that there's a really interesting parallel between that kind of thing and just, the series that we're binging on Netflix and Hulu and so on, right? That there's this, people are really love to kind of dive into something and see where it takes you for a while, for X number of hours or whatever. So anyway, I decided to do a series called Seeing White, which is a 14-part series about whiteness, and just a kind of a fairly deep dive into the construction of race and racism, and how we got this whole thing and how it has developed and evolved over time. And working with a friend and colleague named Chenjerai Kumanyika, who's a scholar at Rutgers, and he and I kind of collaborated on that series, which came out in 2017. And then actually the result of that was that I didn't anticipate this at all. I thought, who's going to want to hear this? I don't know, but had this it was fairly early in the history of the podcast, and we thought the audience was pretty small. And I didn't anticipate the audience would grow as a result of that series, but it did, like a lot. And it got some attention and put the show on the map in a significant way. And then, kind of inspired by that reaction and by the experience of it and what I learned and what people seem to learn from it, I've followed that up and worked with a different collaborator and made a series on patriarchy called Men. And that's a 12-part series, again, about 8 hours long, that came out in 2018. And the current series, which we're 3/4 of the way through, is a series about looking at American democracy, or not so much. It's called The Land That Never Has Been Yet, which is a quote from Langston Hughes. But it sort of tells this, tells the story of America, or retells it sort of through the lens of the extent to which sort of anti-democratic forces have been very powerful from the creation of the country to this day, contrary to what we hear in middle school, right? So that's a very short description of those 3 series, but that's been incredibly inspiring and satisfying to me to do that kind of work, because I used to feel lucky years ago about the fact that I got to do 1-hour radio documentaries, because that was considered like a big canvas, and not that many people got to do longer form work like that. But to be able to now do like an 8-hour series on a theme, that's sort of what I'm doing these days. So anyway, I'd love to answer your questions, and I guess there kind of have been a couple implicit. Go ahead, Amy.
Thanks, John. I'm curious, we heard that unnarrated piece versus the narrated piece, and I'm curious, when you're done with an interview, is it the elements of the interview that guide you on whether or not you're going to do it narrated or unnarrated, or is that just a creative choice for you?
Good question. Yeah, in that case, I had really set out initially. The unnarrated version is the one that I consider the real one. Like that's the real project. And then, in order to do a version for NPR, I just had to do a different version that had to be considerably shorter, and to air on the narrated version aired on Weekend Edition Saturday, Scott Simon's show. And they just weren't going to, in those days, I mean, not today, maybe they would air a shorter, unnarrated version, but in those days it just didn't. But also we could see that in order to do it I think they told me you could do like 12 minutes or something, right? Which again, that was 2008, I think. That wouldn't happen now. You couldn't do a 12-minute piece on Weekend Edition Saturday. They don't do the pieces that long anymore. But anyway, at that time, so that was kind of the timeline we saw. In order to do any justice to sort of the arc of the longer piece, that it was going to have to be narrated, because narrating just actually it's very efficient. It allows you to kind of, okay, so here's a great piece of tape, right, that I want to use, but I can contextualize that with narration. I can just pack a whole bunch of quick contextual information in there, and then we hear the tape, right? Whereas if you're not in there as a narrator, it's just not as efficient. You can't pack in as much information in the same amount of time. So, but the reason that I've mostly done narrated work, but but there was a period there where I was doing some unnarrated stuff, and I had sort of, through some trial and error and some failure, frankly, like the first time that it occurred to me to try to do a piece without narration, it just didn't work, because I didn't understand how you have to do the interviewing process. If you're going to do that, you have to think very differently as a producer. You have to be thinking, okay, I need this person to, right? They need to say everything that the listener needs to make sense of what's going on here. So, and I've even done some unnarrated stuff where you heard that in that version where that has multiple characters and different scenes, and that's so you need really people to do the work of the narrator by saying, here's who I am, indicating here's what's going on. We're at the soccer game, or we're at soccer practice, or, and you need to be kind of having in mind as you're asking people questions and interviewing them, to basically nudge them to tell you everything that you're going to need in order to even set up that scene, if that's what it is, right? So that kind of stuff. Anyway, but the reason I wanted to do that with that project, I had been in North Carolina for a few years when I first conceived of it, but I had this strong sense that, okay, this is a piece about a small town in North Carolina. There are these three communities, white folks, black folks, and Latino immigrants. And there's this sort of drama involving these three groups of people. I'm a white dude interloper from Minnesota. Let's see if we can do this without my voice in there, right? And that mediating voice, but also that like outsider voice. Let's just see if we can do it in a way that people in this community are speaking for themselves, literally, right? So that was, and I almost felt like it was almost so much about the voices and the accents, or they were such a strong element in an audio piece like that. So that's why I originally did it that way.
Great, thank you.
I have a question. Oh yeah. So, but when you choose the people to interview, it did seem to me almost like Paul Quadros stood in.
Yes.
For you as the sort of the voice of the context and history, and gave the kind of authority that you then so scrutiny did for the NPR piece, but that you chose in some ways him as a stand-in for, if not you, the kind of authorial voice.
No, that's absolutely right. And that's a really good observation. He was in many ways effectively the narrator. And actually the moment that I knew for sure that I was going to do that piece and that I could do it and that I felt like, okay, I think I know what I'm up to here, is Paul and I went out to dinner. And he said that thing about the 5 stages of grief. And I was like, oh, damn. I was like writing it down, like, 5 stages of grief. You can build a half-hour documentary on that. So, yeah, no, you're absolutely right.
Wait, Ian,
Just
you're
one other
muted.
question.
Yeah.
Okay. Have you gone back since then to see how the community developed?
I haven't gone back so much, although I've stayed in touch with Paul and I've followed it, and there have been other, and actually there was a film made with Paul a few years afterwards, and I've sort of stayed in. Well, one thing that happened is ultimately the chicken plants closed. First one, and then the other, and so that really changed. But interestingly, that didn't mean that all of those, immigrants from Mexico and Central America left. They mostly stayed, and are working in other places or other Chapel Hill and Siler City is increasingly kind of a bedroom community. And there certainly was some white flight. There were people who just decided we don't want to live here anymore in a majority Latino town. But a lot of other people, they just kind of adapted. And so, yeah, there haven't been, as to my mind, there hasn't been, I guess, a clear enough reason to revisit it, say, with a follow-up documentary, but I have paid some attention to what's going on.
Fonda?
I've read a couple of articles where some people have experimented with adding sound behind sound. So, and I've listened to a couple of podcasts where, so you hear the person talking, but you also kind of hear a little background noise, I guess. I don't really know how to describe it, but I have found that to me, sometimes it does really enhance the audio. Like you can kind of get, because you can't read it or see it, sometimes you can kind of feel that you're there because they've found a way to add additional sound, like the way the environment sounds, or a train, or something like that. So it's like really intriguing to me. So have you had any experience with that, or is there some type of, is that called something?
Well, when you say the sounds are added, because
maybe like I just am so used to listening to like a lecture, so then you don't really hear. But like if you are doing an interview, there are additional sounds that are around. And I listened to a podcast and I just kind of, it seemed like they really worked on that because I could hear like certain things behind them, but it wasn't so loud that I couldn't hear them, but it just kind of made the experience a little bit more real to me.
Yeah. Well, especially both of those versions of that Siler City piece, but certainly in the longer one, there's a lot of that. You're at the soccer game, or you're at soccer practice, or you're at, you're in scenes through actually most of the piece. So is that what you mean?
How do you, I mean, so is that like, I'm just gonna, how do you come up with that?
It's very simple. I mean, it's very organic. When you hear, if somebody's in a scene, that's how I recorded it. I'm not adding it. I mean, there might be some things done in the production that have to, for example, say if I interview somebody at a soccer game, there's a sense in which there's ambient sound, right? You're sitting in the bleachers at the high school soccer game, and there is sound there. There are people around. There's a kind of general hubbub of sound, and so that's just going to be in the recording when that person's speaking. But then you also may do things because you'll record raw sound. You'll take time. You'll spend time sitting there recording the sound as the game without people speaking, right? Beds of sound of this kind of the ambient sound. But then say somebody scores a goal and people yell loud or something, then you might put that in a certain place, right? And actually that happened too, right? Where Jenny Pleasance also yells because all of a sudden yells because their team scored a goal and she's yelling at right. So you're going to be moving things around in time. There's nothing, it's not real time. There's no such thing as like real time for the most part. Everything is sort of situated, and layered sometimes, but it's also in, what's the word I'm looking for? It's audio verite, right? Where they're in that space. And I actually have pretty strong ethical guidelines about that sort of thing. I wouldn't make it sound like somebody was in a scene if they weren't, and if I didn't record them there. Mm-hmm. I may do things like, what's an example? Actually, this is Jenny Pleasance. You remember who she is? She's the white woman who, she's the soccer mom, and then she was upset about going to the doctor's office and so many, Mexican people there and whatever. Kind of racist, right? But she, so I interviewed her at the soccer game, and I also interviewed her at her flower shop. And I think what does happen there is when you go, she's at the soccer game, and then when she starts saying that thing about, what really bothers me though, or some words to that effect, is when I go, what really gets me though, is you go to the hospital and it's not like it used to be when they just know your name and down in there. It's all these people. Actually, if you listen carefully, the soccer game sound trails off and goes away. Because by the time because that was not recorded at the soccer game, that particular comment. And so it's almost probably wouldn't even be conscious maybe for the listener that you've left the soccer game. But I also didn't want to pretend that entirely that she said that at the soccer game. So I'm kind of sneaking the sound out.
So John, would it be accurate to say your ethic is, it's fine to put together things that might not have happened at the same time, if you're not changing people's words or changing their meaning or altering what they, how their representation, but you wouldn't, for example, put the sound of the soccer game underneath that, because then that would be making it seem like you had that conversation with her at the soccer game. So to you, it's fine to put those two conversations together and edit them. So it starts at the soccer game, it has some of that from another place and ends at the soccer game, but the line for you is you didn't hide that fact. You didn't make it sound like it was all the same place, because it wasn't. Is that?
Yeah, I think in a way there are a couple of questions or things embedded in your question. One is, to what extent do you put things together that people said or edit their words? And I do edit their words, but I'm always very careful to not mess with the spirit of what they were saying and what I understood them to be saying. And I have never, excuse me, should have muted myself before doing, but that can even mean, moving within, say, something that somebody says over the course of a minute, or a couple minutes, kind of taking this part and putting it here as like, literally reorganizing it a little bit, because really what you're doing is making it, sometimes actually making it more coherent. And I've literally never in 30 plus years had somebody call me up and say, hey, I didn't like the way you you moved my words around. You made me sound more coherent than I really was. I actually think people don't, listeners probably don't know. They probably think they said it that way, right? Because the spirit of what they said is always maintained. And I've also never had anybody call me up and say, you lifted something out of context or made me say something I didn't say. Because I'm really careful about not doing that. So there's that question. But yes, as to the kind of the scene placement in a scene or something like that, I've gotten into some arguments because I'm a relative purist about that kind of thing. Like there was a filmmaker someone who had done more film and then was also done audio. And I think maybe this is more common in documentary film, is to just sort of do sound effects or anyway, but this person was talking about, she had been out in a place where somebody with some bird watchers or something, they were looking for a bird and they saw the bird, but the bird was way off in the distance and you couldn't hear the damn bird, it just didn't, right? So she's making an audio piece. She thinks, I wish I had the sound of that bird. So she just got the sound of the bird off the web somewhere and put it in the scene. And I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do that. If I did, and I said, I think it could actually be more charming even to say, especially if you're in the piece as the narrator, to say, the damn bird was too far away, so we couldn't hear it. But if we had been closer, here's what it would have sounded, and just be straight with the listener, that we weren't able to record it, but here's what that bird sound would sound like.
And how far do you go?
Yeah, I wouldn't. To me, the implication is if you hear it.
Go ahead.
The implication for me is if you're listening to one of my pieces, and I'm setting a scene that's clear that I was there and I'm recording and here's this person and blah, blah, blah. Any sound that you hear is something that I actually recorded in that place, more or less at that time. and that if it's not that, I feel like I'm lying to you somehow. So that was the issue.
My question about that, I feel like I see that, Barry, I see you want to ask a question next. I just was going to say, John, and then we'll hear from Barry, but if it felt really important to you to have a particular sound, would it be okay to go back and if you could go back and get that bird, the next day in the same place at the, is a field recording, would that be okay? Like, how much does it happened in the moment matter to that?
Yeah, that might be okay. Especially, I guess it would depend on how specific you were being, right? Like if you're in a scene where somebody's looking for a bird, and then they say, the bird watcher you're following all of a sudden says, "Oh, there it is," and then you like added the sound of the bird tweet. I don't know. I might feel like I was passing that off as if I recorded it right then and in that moment. I don't know. I'd feel funny about that. But if it were more like, I don't know, if you were making a less direct claim or seemed to be implying a less direct claim about it happening right at that moment or something, it's hard to judge. Yeah, it's hard to.
Thanks.
Let's just say I haven't run into that exact issue.
Barry? Barry, did you want to ask your
I'd be
question?
curious if people think I'm crazy for being so. Oh, I think you're muted, Barry.
Yes, I just noticed that. I'm sorry. I am, of course, a reader, a librarian, and so I'm concerned with being able to follow a thread, to connect sounds up, to know that it's the same woman at the soccer game as talking about the hospital and her flower shop. That one's fairly easy. I like your word coherence. Another thing I'm worried about is relative importance, the highlights of what's being said, so that you can connect and organize in your mind what you're hearing. You know, librarians, text people have a long history of all sorts of typographic aids to help you follow and comprehend and assess what you are reading. And I'm a newcomer to podcasts and to audio, and so how do you organize? How do you pull these threads together? How do you help the listener, guide them through this? I kind of like the narrated one because I'm so naive and such a newbie that I had trouble doing all these connections on the longer, fuller piece without some help. And so that's what I'm interested in, is how do you help the listener organize and thread together what you're saying.
Excuse me. Yeah, I was going to guess that maybe you found the narrated one easier to take in because, there's more, you know, kind of what some people call signposting. Right, where it's sort of here's and oftentimes the narration can set that up in a really clear way. Like this is almost literally saying like this is really listen, you know, and oftentimes you're trying not to repeat an idea, but when you really want something to be very clear, you will kind of almost say it or say part of it right up to the lead up, and then the person says the thing that kind of, you know, that clarifies or that finishes the thought. Yeah, so absolutely, and you're not the only person to give me similar feedback about those two pieces, right? Even the fact that this I remember this, and it's been quite a while, obviously, since I made those pieces, but I know that there were some people who didn't really get the significance that I heard in the thing at the very end where Jenny Pleasance is yelling. They score a goal and she's yelling the name of a Latina girl. I can't remember the name right now, but this is the same person who earlier in the piece was expressing frustration. You can't pronounce the names, and you know, and now she's cheering and yelling this girl's name and seeming to do just fine and yelling the girl's name. Right? And I think in the narrated version, I can't remember how we set it up exactly, but how I set it up. But I think there was a way that sort of that made it that put just a little bit more of an underline under the fact that Jenny seemed to be doing just fine on this particular day, especially after you know, the team is winning because of these girls and whatnot, right? So yes, but to answer, how can I answer your question? I mean, you know, the kind of stuff that I'm doing now is a lot of history, and it's there's a lot of information, and quite a bit of information that's new to me, and I think to most listeners, and it's very what I would say didactic, in the sense that it's really, we're quite open about the fact that we're kind of taking you to, taking us all to school here. And there's a lot of signposting and being very clear about what we're saying. And so, yes, but people do that in varying degrees. And there are some people who make radio documentaries who say, signposting, I hate it. And it's like, okay, fair enough. But it depends on what you're up to and what your listeners like too. Some people don't want to be guided that much.
Amy, go ahead.
Sean, after all these years working with interviews, I'd love some insight into the barometer that you use now to, you're working with an interview and just realize I can't make this into anything. I just need to pass on this. And in that same vein, when a piece is done and ready to go.
Both good questions. Some interviews just aren't so good, right? It didn't deliver what you thought it did. And there are these various pieces of that, right? Maybe the information was good, but the way the person delivers it isn't very interesting, or they just not a good talker, or, et cetera, et cetera. Or they didn't know as much as you thought they did, so it just doesn't bring the oomph that you thought it did. There are all kinds of reasons that interviews don't work. Actually, it's interesting that you guys heard that Siler City project, because that is, without a doubt, I think the project that of all my years of doing this that I did the most interviews that didn't get used. And some of them were really interesting and important and worthy, but a lot of it had to do with that project. We really chipped away in trying to figure out what the focus was and kind of who the characters were. And then that's another thing about doing an unnarrated piece, even though that was relatively heavily populated piece for an unnarrated piece, a number of people had to introduce themselves in different scenes and all that. It did make me not want to, have 5 more people in there, because if you're narrating, it's just much more easy. You could bring somebody on for one quote and say, well, this is Pastor so-and-so who I interviewed, and there's this one other aspect, this one other point I want to make, and I'm just going to write into that and contextualize it, and there's his 30-second quote, and then he gets pulled off stage and never heard from again. Right? That's easier to do in a narrated piece. In an unnarrated one, it feels like an investment to really kind of establish each character. So anyway, I interviewed the police chief, and I interviewed a couple of pastors, because I thought churches might be that's a place that's potentially interesting for this kind of cultural exploration I was doing. And there were several interviews, anyway, a number that I just didn't use for no reason other than that decided to use, these were the ones that we are going to use, right? But yeah, sometimes it just happens. Or if an interview is a standalone for an episode or something for a podcast, it's painful. One thing that's painful is that you maybe have told this person that you're interviewing for your podcast, and then you end up, it's hard, right? I just didn't work out, or decide to go in a different direction, or however you're going to say it. So yes, it happens. What was the other question?
What's the moment that that a piece is?
Oh yeah. Now that's certainly is developed with experience, more than when you start out. But there's a sense that I have that I've sort of covered the bases, and that there's a certain amount of complexity that I either saw from the start, or that I saw as I learned more about this story I was telling, or this issue I was exploring. Anyway, that you feel like you've at a certain point, you've got all the angles covered, right? And they're going to be diminishing returns if you try to pack anything else in or any more interviews. And then, I've usually been privileged to work with editors. So I've certainly, looking back further in my career, I've certainly been in situations where I thought I was done and I had an editor tell me, you need to, there's a big hole here, or there's this question that's unanswered. You need to get another voice in here or something like that. I've certainly been there.
Go ahead, Judith.
So I think sort of following on that, how do you know how you're going to structure the piece? Do you sort of have that in mind as you're doing the interviews? Or do you wait until you have it all together? Or do you have a working outline? How do you sort out the structure that you're going to follow?
Yeah, good question. And not everybody is the same on this. I don't have an outline in mind. I don't know, my brain doesn't work that way. Excuse me. I do make an outline afterwards. And I had to be trained in that. For years when I was a cub reporter, I didn't do that. And I would wrestle and struggle with the structure and move things around a lot. Or I'd get to writing what I thought was the kind of concluding paragraph as narrator, and then I would look at it and realize, oh, I finally figured out what the piece is about, and that's my intro, and then move that up and kind of. But anyway, I had a really good editor I worked with for a number of years who basically made me make outlines, and it helped. It helped a lot. You don't always end up with the outline that you sketch out, but I do that now, and it helps. Basically, it just it forces you to think, first of all. And when I teach, I talk a lot about writing the introduction, whether it's you imagine it as the host of a radio show, what would Ira Glass say if he's introducing your piece, or a host of one of the NPR shows or whatever. Or if you're envisioning a text on a website or a podcast, right, that's going to kind of pull people in, and it's going to frame maybe what's the key question you're asking or whatever it is. That's really important, because in order to write that, you have to know what the hell your piece is and what it's about and what is the question you're asking. And so writing that, and then just forcing myself to think, okay, how am I entering into the piece? What's the first thing that happens? And is there kind of a logic? It could just be a chronology if you're just telling a story. But even if it's a pure story that has a chronology, you're not necessarily starting at the beginning, right? A gazillion movies and novels and everything that we consume kind of start in the middle. You think of that classic opening scene in a movie where, the horses are coming over the hills and the people are like getting ready to go into battle or whatever it is, right? And then that's actually turns out to be like the climax of the story, and it stops and you don't find out what happened. And then it goes back 10 years or whatever, and then comes back, and then you come back to that moment 80% through the movie, right? So there are classic structures like that. But if it's more of an issue kind of thing, it's sort of, what's my question, and is there a natural way to get into presenting that question, and then a kind of a flow of ideas that makes sense. And you force yourself to try to think that through. And then by doing that, I find that I feel a lot better than when I start to actually like write and assemble the piece, because at least I have a plan. And then later, if I decide, actually, this structure, there's something I want to change, this isn't working, then even then you can kind of see, okay, you've got the building blocks in front of you. So if you move this, then you can kind of see, instead of just being lost, right, with this chaos, it helps to keep it in some sort of control. So that's your question.
Yeah, something else? Another
Yep.
question?
Go ahead.
This is just, different, but did you find out something like really surprising in the story that changed the direction of where you thought it was going to go?
In that one, in the Siler City one?
Mm-hmm.
Well, actually, I think that happened pretty early, and it happened probably with what comes to mind. There were things that surprised me, like some of the nuances of the way, for example, that the African American people that I talked to, the way that they saw the Latino immigrant community, and there were just things like that just make you happy as a producer, like the two sisters, Pookie and
Mm-hmm.
what's her sister's name, right? The fact here are the two sisters, and their family's been in this town for generations, and they're both thoughtful people, but they have this like quite different take. Remember, and it was almost in thinking structurally in my mind. It was sort of like one sister was frustrated that. So Pookie, remember, so she saw that in her mind, I could think she was thinking economically, and she's saying, look, basically these Latino immigrant folks, they're sort of at the bottom of the ladder economically. And so she had this kind of compassionate response about that. But her sister was annoyed by things like the fact that they seemed to be, followed around in stores less than Black people still are, right? So stuff like that. In some social ways, it's like Latinos were maybe being, into what I would now say, especially with all the stuff I've done about whiteness, maybe they're closer to white, right? So in some ways they were higher on the scale from the perspective of the kind of the white elite in town. Anyway, so just stuff like that. It's like, oh man, that's interesting, right? So, just to be able to present that with those two voices. But the big thing was actually, I thought when I first started out, it's going to be a real bummer of a piece about all the racism in Siler City in response to this wave of immigration, right? And then when Paul Quadros told me, basically, when he sort of did that 5 stages of grief thing, and he said that actually, Will, we've come some way. And things aren't the way they were a few years ago when David Duke was coming to town. And the town has actually made considerable progress in sort of adapting to this reality. That was kind of the big, but it was really before the beginning stage of doing the recordings and whatnot. But that's when that happened. I thought that it wasn't the story that I initially, and Ira Glass likes to say, when the story isn't what you thought it was, that's when you know you have a story.
Yeah.
So, John,
And that's actually that ties to what we were talking about last week. With
it's okay. Go ahead.
Me?
Yeah, go ahead. Finish.
So that kind of ties to last week when we were talking about I think we're having a sound problem. I don't know. So we were talking about how you would, pitch what you're going to do to somebody, but then what if it kind of turns out differently and you deliver a different piece? I think that came up last time.
Yeah.
That's just a comment more than a question. Is you may get something different out of it, and then you may have donors or supporters or people who expect one thing that you have to negotiate. Oh, well, I told you it was going to be a piece about it was uplifting, but these it's really a bummer because these people are really pissed, and they said, but I wanted a happy piece. So you have to negotiate that, I suppose. It makes it difficult to think about how you're going to pitch a story in the beginning when you really don't know how it's going to come out.
Yeah.
Or you shouldn't, because you're not open if you know how it's going to come out.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've had, especially, you know, in my days of dealing with gatekeepers at public radio shows, for instance, I've had pieces that didn't get on the air because I thought, I can think of, for example, an investigative piece about white supremacist prison guards in a prison that I'd heard about. And it was sort of like, as it turned out, the evidence that I was able to really nail down just wasn't, like the editor at NPR that I was working with just didn't find it enough. And we could even disagree about that, right? But it's sort of like, yeah, you just really didn't quite deliver. And so we can't put this piece on the air. I'm not going to put this piece on the air. You know, that stuff happens. Or yes, it just shifts in a different sort of way. It turns out that it's not what I thought. And then you're communicating with the editor or a gatekeeper or whatever, and maybe they go with you and say, oh, well, it's still interesting. It's not what I thought. Or maybe they say, nah, I was only interested if it was going to be plan A. But if you have your own show, if you still find it interesting, then you put the damn thing out, right?
Really?
So I'm sorry that my sound is lagging so much. Can you all hear me? Can you tell that I'm talking? Can you guys hear me? Yes, no, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know why my sound is lagging so much. Okay. I know we're about out of time, but John, if I maybe two things. One, if you have any other examples of ethical decisions you've had to make in audio work that might be interesting to share. And the other is, given what you've said about not starting with an outline and but having in your mind, you know, some ideas, can you just describe how you go, if you're doing a piece that requires going out in the field and talking to people more than, you know, just calling people for interviews and something like that. But if you're doing something that has field recording, can you just talk a little about your process? Like, how do you think about, okay, I need to set this scene, I need some place stuff, I need to, you know, like just walk us through your thought process of how you do that, and then come back and what you listen for as you're listening to your tape, which we still call it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So how can I answer that? I guess I have some sense of, I mean, I know why I'm interested in this scene. And I know that I want to bring it to life to some extent, even if it's a pretty brief thing. So I just to even take a more recent example, I was doing an episode as part of our current season about the kind of the vast expansion of the cotton economy in the US in the first half of the 19th century, right? And how, and in order to dramatize that, actually, instead of going to Mississippi or someplace, I went to Providence, Rhode Island, to a historic site that's a cotton mill, right? So partly also then it's sort of doing double duty of making the point that the whole country's economy was built to an incredible extent on cotton money, the cotton industry. And so there are tens of thousands of jobs, right, that were created in New England in cotton milling plants, all the cotton coming from these expanded slave cotton states in the Alabama, Mississippi, and so on, right? Georgia. So, so I knew that I wanted, so I know that I want to, here I am at this place in Rhode Island, Pawtucket actually, and, you know, giving a little feel, what does it look like? So I'm thinking, you know, can I get this person to describe a little bit what it looks like, or I can also do that as narrator. Is there some sound that's going to help take the listener there in some way? Sound of the river, because the mill was powered by the river. And then I have someone who is talking to me and telling me how this happened and what it looked like at the time, and, you know, kind of how it all went down and what the significance was. And in a way that I can kind of stay in that scene for a couple of minutes while I'm getting that information across. Does that answer the question? So
Yeah,
I'm just sort of
thank you.
thinking about what are the elements that I can get here that are going to make it as interesting as possible and sort of rich with sound in a way that makes you feel like you've been taken to this place in a certain way.
Yeah, thank you. I
have
think
a
it's,
feeling you're talking, Joy, but we're not.
I know, there, now can you hear me?
Okay, there you
Okay.
are.
I think
Yeah.
it's very helpful for people who are new to, you know, who are trying to picture, as Fonda was saying, like, how do I think about sound as well as words? So I think that's helpful to picture. Thank you, John, for spending an hour of your Thursday with us. We really appreciate it. Are you going to do the audio class this summer?
Yes.
Do you want to plug that briefly?
We canceled, at least for the summer. Well, the intro course, Hearing is Believing, we actually canceled it, or at least we're not doing it this summer. Because that one, people come to Durham and we have prearranged, you know, interviews for them to do, and it just seemed like too much to contemplate how to reconstruct that and do it online. But the more advanced one, seeing is making it sing. At least at this point, it may depend actually on whether we get enough people to sign up. But that one's happening. That one you do your own recordings and bring something and get kind of small group and individual attention as you build something over the course of 5 or 6 days. That one's in late July, making it sing. And at this point, at least we're going to try to do it if we get enough people.
Thank you. Thank
John,
you
would
very
that be
much.
a class, as long as you have content to work with, you could take, even if you're a beginner? Or a relative beginner?
Yes, but so really the key variable is with that one, the reason that we consider it a more advanced course is that we don't teach, for example, we don't teach you to build the piece on editing software.
Okay.
So we presume that you can do that, or you have enough of a kind of basic capability. But yes, so long as you're willing to kind of muddle through in that regard, generally we've worked with people.
Okay, thank you.
Would the beginner course be next summer? Like, since it's not this summer, would it?
I hope so. We've done it every summer since 2003. This will be the first year. We haven't done it since then. So if the world is, you know, such that people are moving around again next summer, I hope, I would assume we would do it. That one's called Hearing is Believing. If you want to look up either one of those for the descriptions on the CDS courses site.
Do you have other suggestions for things like to do, you know, prior, if that's our interest, but we don't want to be advanced yet, like just for learning? You have other.
A couple things I would point you to. There's a website called transom.org that's done by some great radio people up in Massachusetts, and there's a whole bunch of resources on there. It's really designed for people who are kind of trying to teach themselves to do audio work. I guess that's probably, I would just point that out. And there are other courses. I don't know to what extent other people are doing their courses though, because most of them, you know, involve meeting someplace. And, so, yeah. Okay, good to meet y'all. Good
Thank you,
questions.
John.
I enjoyed it.
Thanks so much.
Thank
Enjoy
you.
the rest of your class.
Nice meeting you.
All right, take care.
Good night.
Good night.
So can you hear me now when I'm talking?
Yes.
A little?
It's just really lagging as you're talking.
Yeah, it's making me crazy. Actually, I linked the Transom site to the week 5 page of the website for you to look at as part of your homework. So it's already up there. And there's an article John wrote that I linked as well that's specifically about silence, about leaving room for pauses in audio work, but I think it's also something that's important in interviewing. And even if you're not interested in audio work, go look at the Transom website. If you are doing audio, they have great reviews of pretty much any piece of audio equipment, recorders, microphones, you know, anything that you can really try to figure out what will work for you for your budget. But they also have a whole section on techniques, and people will talk about interviewing, you know, mishaps they've had in interviewing, challenges, ethical dilemmas. So lots of really interesting essays and firsthand, you know, stories and suggestions. And one thing I really like is they often include bits of tape, so they, you know, they illustrate what they're talking about by saying, this is what it was like before, and this is what it was like after, you know, if they're talking about a choice they made. And so that's really helpful, especially if you're, you know, if you're new to trying to think about all of these choices that go into telling a story. I wanted to play a few things for you, and those of you who know Zoom better than me, is that going to lag also if I share the screen and play audio or a video? Do you have any experience with that?
I think it likely will. We can give it a shot and see. We'll let you know.
I think it probably would.
Yeah.
All right.
Are you able to send us links so we can open it just in our own browsers,
let me just,
like through the chat window?
Let me say this. I'm frustrated. I have things I want to talk about, but it's frustrating to me to talk like this because I can tell that, you know, my little screen doesn't even light up until I've been talking for a minute. I'm sure it's frustrating for you all. So I can do two things. One is I could try restarting my computer and then redoing the meeting. The other is my plan was to have a shorter class next week because we're gonna watch a movie during the week, and usually we would watch it together in class, but we're not gonna sit and watch a 90-minute long movie together in class. So I'm gonna give you the link for it, and then I figured we'd, you know, just meet a little less time next week. But what we can do, the other option is we can do that this week. We can end a little early, and you can have that time to go ahead and watch the film. And I can send you the links for the 3 pieces I wanted to show you that are about examples of students, former students doing storytelling, telling you about a project or describing. So we can start thinking about these decisions and choices of putting a story together, crafting a story. So which of those appeals to you, of those two choices?
You might want to try to cut your video first too. If you cut your video, sometimes it doesn't try to send, because right now it's trying to send audio and your video. So if you cut your video, your audio might get a little bit better. You can just try that just to see, because it works with us a lot.
Okay, does my talking seem any better? I think it's my internet connection. Because I keep getting a notice that says your internet connection's unstable, and there's nothing I can do about that, because I even tried to run it through a hotspot on my phone and it didn't make it any better. So.
Well, you're a little bit smoother for me now. You don't have as many breaks when you're talking now, but I'm not sure about other people.
Yeah, it seems a little smoother for me too.
I don't know, do you have any children who are now online watching TV or, otherwise using up some of your internal bandwidth?
No, I'm here by myself for once, actually.
Well, you could probably try to share now and see because I can hear you very well now. You can try it.
Okay.
See.
Will you text and chat if it's lagging or you can't hear it? How about that?
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I can tell it's still lagging because my little screen doesn't even light up that shows that I'm the one talking until I've been talking for like 20 seconds. And then I don't know if you've heard me, but it's just delayed, or if you didn't hear any of that I said. So I think it's going to make me nuts. So let's go back to these two choices. Do you want me, I can restart things here and then we can come back together, or I can send you the links and some information and we can have this be our short class and you can watch the movie for next week. Does anybody have a vote?
I'm kind of voting for the short class because it's frustrating and difficult to follow.
That looks like
Okay.
the majority based on the chat.
Yeah.
Well, okay, can you hear me?
Now, yes.
Okay, I got
Long
the Zoom
pauses.
Yeah, I'm gonna type.
Yeah.
Can you see what I'm typing?
Yes.
Okay. All right. That's crazy. So I'm just gonna stay here and send info to you all, and you can work on it tonight or sometime during the week, okay? All right, thanks. And
Thank
call
you.
me if you want to talk about your project, call me and let's chat, okay? If you have questions about your project or you want to run something by me, just let's make a date and have a phone conversation this week, okay? All right, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Good night.
Bye.
Hey.